Margaret Sullivan stood in her wheat field, watching the sky turn dark with alien ships, and she did not move from where she planted her feet in the soil that she and her husband had worked for 20 years before he died. The ships were ugly things that looked like metal insects, and they carried the Krelith raiders, who had been hitting human colonies all along the frontier for the past 6 months. Everyone in New Haven Colony knew they were coming, because the warning had gone out 3 hours ago, and most of the 2,000 people who lived here had already run to the shelters in the main settlement. Margaret had received the message on her old data pad while she was checking the irrigation system in the south field, and she had read it. Twice before deleting it and going back to work, her neighbor Paul Jenkins had come racing up her dirt road in his hauler truck, kicking up dust and yelling at her to get in, but Margaret had just shaken her head and told him to save himself. Paul was 70 years old and had known Margaret since she and Daniel first came to New Haven, as young colonists full of dreams about building something that would last. He had watched her bury her son after the farming accident that took him at age 16, and he had stood beside her 3 years ago when they put Daniel in the ground after the sickness ate him from the inside. Paul knew that look in Margaret's eyes, and he knew there was no point in arguing with her when she made up her mind about something. The Krelith were bug creatures that stood on 4 legs and had arms that ended in claws, and they made clicking sounds when they talked to each other in their own language. They came to frontier worlds like New Haven because these places were far from the big human military bases, and they could steal food and equipment and be gone before anyone with guns and ships could stop them. The pattern was always the same according to the reports Margaret had read on the Colonial Network. The bugs would land and the humans would run, and the bugs would take everything and leave. Nobody fought back because nobody had the weapons or training to fight. Back in the bugs knew this. Margaret was 60, 2 years old, and her hands were tough from years of working the land, and her back hurt most mornings, but she could still put in a full day of work without complaining. She had short gray hair that she kept tied back and a face that the sun had turned brown and wrinkled. She was not a soldier, and she had never fired a gun at another living thing, but she had spent the last 3 years building something that her husband had started before he got too sick to finish. Daniel had been worried about raiders even back then when the attacks were just starting, and he had begun installing systems around the farm that could protect them if trouble came. After he died, Margaret had kept working on his project because it gave her something to do besides sit in the empty house and remember all the people she had lost. The farm covered 200 acres and grew wheat and corn and vegetables that fed a good portion of the colony. Margaret had 3 barns and a main house and a workshop that Daniel had built, and a greenhouse where she grew tomatoes and peppers. But underneath all of that normal farm appearance was something else. Daniel had been an engineer before he became a farmer, and he had known how to make machines do things they were not designed to do. Margaret had learned from him, and after he died, she had taught herself even more by reading technical manuals late at night when sleep would not come. The Krelith ships landed 3 miles away in the open fields beyond the Jenkins property, and Margaret watched them through the camera feeds she had set up around her land. There were 3 ships, and they were small, fast raiding vessels that could carry about 20 bugs each. She counted 47 Krelith as they came out of the ships and started moving toward the human farms in a loose group. They were not being careful because they had no reason to be careful. Humans ran away and left everything behind, and the bugs just took what they wanted. Margaret went down to her basement, which Daniel had converted into a control room 5 years ago. The walls were covered with monitors showing different views of the farm, and there was a control panel that looked like it belonged on a spaceship instead of under a farmhouse. She sat down in the old chair that still smelled like Daniel's coffee, and she started powering up the systems one by one. The sensors came online first, and they began tracking the movement of the Krelith force as it spread out across the neighboring properties. Then the automated defenses went to standby mode, waiting for her command. Margaret had tested everything 100 times, but she had never used any of it for real, and her hands shook a little as she entered the activation codes. The first group of 12 Krelith reached the edge of her property just as the sun was starting to set. They were led by a big one that seemed to be giving orders to the others, and they moved through the wheat field on the south side without any caution. Margaret watched them on the monitor and waited until they were exactly where she needed them to be. She pressed a button, and the ground under the lead bug exploded upward in a cloud of white powder that covered all 12 of them. The powder was a mixture of things that Margaret had spent 6 months perfecting in her workshop. and it was designed specifically for Krelith biology based on the information she had found in colonial intelligence reports. The bugs started making horrible clicking, screaming sounds, and they fell down in the wheat, thrashing around as their breathing holes seized up and their eyes burned. Margaret did not feel good about hurting living things, but she also did not feel bad about it. These creatures had come to steal everything she had built, and they would have destroyed her farm without a second thought. She had given them a choice by simply being here and being ready, and they had chosen to walk into her field anyway. That made what happened next their own fault as far as she was concerned. The Krelith commander, whose name was something humans could not pronounce, watched 3 of his warriors go down in the wheat field, and he made the rapid clicking sound that meant danger to his raiders. The remaining bugs scattered away from the white cloud and regrouped near the fence line where they thought they would be safe from whatever trap the humans had left behind. The commander had raided 17 human colonies in the past year, and not one of them had fought back with anything more than a few desperate shots from hunting rifles. This was different and wrong, and it made his antenna twitch with confusion. He sent 5 more warriors forward to scout the farmhouse while the rest of his group stayed back and watched. The 5 bugs moved carefully, now staying low and spreading out so they would not all get caught in another trap. They made it halfway across the open yard between the wheat field and the house before the sprinkler system activated. At first, the commander thought it was just water because that is what human farming sprinklers usually sprayed, but then his warriors started screaming and falling and clawing at their own shells. Margaret had modified the irrigation system 2 years ago, after reading about Krelith exoskeleton composition in a biology report that someone had posted on the Colonial Defense Network. The bugs had porous shells that absorbed certain chemicals very easily, and she had mixed up a batch of liquid that would burn through those pores and cause intense pain. It was mostly citric acid from her lemon trees combined with capsaicin extract that she made from hot peppers, and a few other ingredients that she had ordered from the agricultural supply depot. To a human it would sting and irritate, but to a Krelith, it was like being covered in acid. The 5 scouts rolled on the ground trying to get the liquid off, but the sprinklers kept spraying, and Margaret kept watching from her basement control room with her hand steady on the button. She let the sprayers run for 30 seconds before shutting them off, and by then all 5 bugs were down and not moving much. The rest of the Krelith group was making loud clicking and whistling sounds that Margaret's computer translated as distress calls and angry commands. She could see them on the monitors pulling back toward the equipment barn on the east side of her property. The barn was exactly where Margaret wanted them to go. She had spent 8 months converting that building into what Daniel used to call a kill box, back when he was designing it. The barn looked normal from outside with its red paint and big sliding doors, but inside it was full of surprises. Margaret waited until 23 Krelith had moved close to the barn before she activated the next sequence. The doors slid open automatically and 3 of the bugs went inside to investigate because bugs were curious creatures and also very greedy when they saw equipment they could steal. As soon as they were inside, Margaret sealed the doors and activated the ventilation system that she had installed in the roof. The system started pumping a gas into the barn that was heavier than air and would sink down to where the bugs were standing. The gas was not poisonous because Margaret did not want to kill if she did not have to, but it would make the Krelith very sick and very confused. She had made it from a combination of ammonia and other chemicals that interfered with their sensory organs. Within 2 minutes, the 3 bugs inside were stumbling around, unable to see or smell or sense anything properly. The 20 bugs outside heard their companions making distress sounds, and they tried to break down the barn doors. But Margaret had reinforced those doors with steel plating hidden behind the wood exterior. While they were busy trying to break in, she activated the harvester drones that she kept stored in the workshop building. There were 5 drones, and they had been designed to cut wheat stalks, but Margaret had reprogrammed them and added some modifications that Daniel would have been proud of. The drones rolled out of the workshop on their tracks and their cutting. Blades were spinning at full speed. The Krelith saw the drones coming, and at first, they did not understand what they were looking at, because farm equipment was not supposed to be a threat. Then the first drone reached the nearest bug, and its blades cut through 2 of the creature's legs before it could move away. The bug fell down clicking in pain, and the other Krelith finally understood that they needed to run. But Margaret had programmed the drones to work as a team, and they spread out to cut off escape routes while their sensors tracked bug movements across the property. 4 more Krelith went down under the drone blades, and the rest of the group scattered in panic, running in different directions across the farm. Margaret watched them split up, and she activated different defenses in different zones depending on where each bug went. 2 ran into the cornfield and triggered the motion sensors that activated a sound system playing Krelith distress calls at painful volumes. 3 more headed for the main house and ran into an invisible fence that gave them electric shocks calibrated for their biology. 5 tried to circle back toward their ships but found that the access road was now blocked by farming equipment that had moved into position on automated. Trackstock, the Krelith commander, realized too late that he had led his raiders into a trap that was designed by someone who understood exactly how his species moved and fought and thought. This was not random human panic defenses. This was planned and systematic and deadly. He had lost 12 warriors already, and the rest were scattered and injured and terrified. He made the decision to retreat, and he started clicking the emergency withdrawal command. But Margaret's speakers were broadcasting so many conflicting Krelith sounds that his orders got lost in the noise. Margaret took a sip of cold coffee and watched the chaos on her monitors with eyes that showed no emotion, because she had cried all her tears years ago when her son died, and then when Daniel followed him. Now she just had purpose, and that purpose was protecting the land that 3 generations of her family had worked. She could see the Krelith commander trying to rally his remaining raiders near the southern fence, and she knew he would try to make a run for the ships soon. She wanted them to run because she did not want to kill more than she had to, but she also wanted them to remember what happened here, so they would tell other raiders to stay away. She activated the final defense system that Daniel had designed but never got to build before the sickness took him. It was the most complex part of the whole setup, and it had taken Margaret 2 years to get it working properly. The crop-dusting drones that sat in their hidden bay under the greenhouse were originally meant to spray pesticides and fertilizer over large fields, but Margaret had modified them heavily. Each drone now carried tanks filled with a chemical compound that she had developed specifically for Krelith armor. The compound was heat-activated and would bond to their shells and create a burning sensation that got worse over time. The 3 drones lifted off from their bay and flew toward the scattered Krelith raiders using their sensors to track the bug signatures. Margaret had programmed them to focus on the largest groups first and to avoid any areas where colonist life signs might be detected. The drones moved fast and low over the wheat fields, and they began spraying their payload in precise patterns that covered the Krelith, without wasting any chemical. The bugs started clicking in alarm as their shells began to heat up in smoke, and they abandoned any attempt at organized retreat and just ran in blind panic toward their ships. The Krelith commander felt the burning on his backplates and knew that his raid had turned into a complete disaster. He had lost 15 warriors dead or too injured to move, and the rest were running in terror from a single human farm. It was impossible, but it was happening, and he would have to report it to the fleet masters and face their anger. He clicked the order for all raiders to return to the ships immediately, and to leave the wounded behind because there was no time to recover them. His remaining warriors needed no encouragement, and they ran faster than he had ever seen Krelith run. Margaret watched them go, and she did not pursue them beyond her property line. Her defenses were designed to protect her farm, not to chase enemies into open ground. She let the drones return to their bay, and she shut down the active systems one by one until only the sensors remained on alert. The whole fight had lasted less than an hour from the first contact to the final retreat. She climbed the stairs from the basement and walked out onto her front porch in the dim evening light, and looked across her land at the damage. There were dead and dying Krelith, scattered across 3 fields, and some of her equipment was damaged, and there were chemical burns on the grass in several places. It would take weeks to clean up and repair everything, but the farm was still standing and still hers. Margaret felt tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She had just fought and won a battle that should have been impossible for a single old woman, but she took no pride in it. She had done what needed to be done to protect what was hers, and that was all. The Krelith ships lifted off 30 minutes later, and Margaret watched them go on her long-range sensors. They left behind their dead and wounded, and they ran like scared animals back into space. Margaret knew that the colonial authorities would want to know what happened here, and they would come asking questions soon. She also knew that other bugs would hear about this, and maybe they would think twice before raiding New Haven again. That was what Daniel would have wanted, and what her son would have wanted if he had lived long enough to defend his own home. She went back inside and made a fresh pot of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table that Daniel had built from local wood. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the computer systems and the distant sound of her automated irrigation turning on for the evening watering cycle. Margaret pulled out her data pad and started making notes about what had worked and what needed improvement. The sprinkler system had been very effective, but it used too much chemical too quickly. The harvester drones had done their job, but 2 of them had taken damage and would need repairs. The crop dusters had been perfect, but she only had enough chemical for 1 more deployment and she would need to make more. There was always more work to do on a farm, even a farm that doubled as a fortress. Margaret had learned that lesson well over the years. You did your work and you prepared for trouble and you protected what mattered and you kept going no matter what. That was how you survived on the frontier and that was how you honored the people you had lost. She finished her notes and put the data pad away and went to check on her greenhouse because the tomatoes needed attention and work did not stop just because aliens had attacked. The colonial marshal would arrive in the morning with his questions and his security. Team and Margaret would answer honestly because she had nothing to hide. She had defended her property using systems that were legal under colonial law, even if nobody had imagined someone would build anything like what she built. The governor would probably want to talk to her too, and maybe some military people who would be curious about how a farm widow had defeated Kralith raiders without any formal training. Margaret would deal with all of that tomorrow. Tonight she had tomatoes to water and equipment to check and a house to secure before she tried to sleep. She walked through her greenhouse, running her hands over the tomato plants and feeling the familiar texture of leaves and stems. This was what she loved and what she had fought to protect. Not the violence and not the victory, but the simple act of growing things and maintaining life in a harsh universe. Daniel had understood that, and so had their son. And now Margaret carried that understanding forward alone. The farm would continue and the work would continue. And if more raiders came, she would be ready for them just like she had been ready tonight. Colonial Marshal Henry Price arrived at Margaret's farm at 8 in the morning with 6 security officers and 2 medical personnel who were expecting to treat wounded colonists or recover bodies. Instead, they found Margaret in her vegetable garden, pulling weeds like it was any other day and humming an old song that Henry remembered from his childhood. He parked his official vehicle at the end of her driveway and walked up the path while his team spread out to assess the situation. There were clear signs of combat all over the property, and Henry counted at least 10 dead Kralith, and 3 more that were still alive but badly injured. Margaret looked up from her weeding and nodded at Henry in the same way she had nodded at him 100 times before when he came by to check on the outlying farms. She was wearing her usual work clothes and gloves, and her gray hair was tied back with a piece of string. There was dirt on her knees and a scratch on her arm, but otherwise she looked completely normal. Henry had known Margaret for 12 years since he took the marshal job, and he had never seen her rattled by anything, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He cleared his throat and tried to figure out how to start the conversation. Margaret made it easier by speaking first in her calm, steady voice that never seemed to change no matter what was happening. She told him that she had defended her property against Kralith raiders using automated defense systems that her late husband had designed and that she had expanded. She said that she had not violated any colonial laws and that all of her systems were contained within her property boundaries. She offered to show him the control room and explain how everything worked if he wanted to see it. Henry wanted to see it very much because he had read the reports from other colonies about Kralith raids, and none of those reports included anything like what had happened here. He followed Margaret down to her basement and stared at the control room that looked like it belonged on a military vessel. The walls were covered with monitors and sensor readouts, and the control panel had more switches and buttons than Henry could count. Margaret sat down in her chair and began walking him through the systems, explaining each one in simple terms that even someone with no technical knowledge could understand. She showed him the sensor grid that covered her entire property and extended 100 meters beyond her fence line. She explained the chemical delivery systems and how she had developed compounds that were specifically effective against Kralith biology. She demonstrated the automated equipment controls and how the harvester drones could switch from farming to defense mode with a single command. Henry listened and asked questions, and tried not to show how shocked he was by the sophistication of what this farm widow had built in her spare time. When she was done explaining, Henry sat back in his chair and looked at Margaret with new eyes. He had always thought of her as a tough old farmer, who had survived more than her share of tragedy. But now he saw something else. This woman had turned her grief into purpose and her farm into a weapon system that would make military engineers jealous. He asked her how long it had taken to build all of this, and she told him that Daniel had started the basic framework 5 years ago, and that she had been expanding it for the 3 years since he died. She said it had given her something to focus on during the long nights. When the loneliness got too heavy, Henry pulled out his data pad and checked the colonial legal codes looking for any regulation that Margaret might have violated. He scrolled through sections on property defense and automated systems and weapons restrictions, and he could not find anything that specifically prohibited what she had done. The laws had been written assuming that colonists would install basic security like fences and alarms, not full combat defense networks. Margaret had found a gap in the regulations and filled it with something that nobody had anticipated. Henry told her that technically she had not broken any laws, but that the governor would definitely want to talk to her about all of this. Margaret said that the governor was welcome to visit during normal hours and that she would answer any questions honestly. Henry smiled a little at her calm response because most people would be nervous about getting called in by the governor, but Margaret treated it like someone asking to borrow a tool. He asked her what she planned to do now, and she said she planned to repair the damaged equipment and clean up the mess, and get back to farming. She had crops that needed attention and work did not stop just because some bugs had made poor decisions. One of Henry's security officers came down to the basement and reported that they had found 15 dead Kralith and 4 wounded ones scattered across the property. The wounded ones were in bad shape and probably would not survive without immediate medical care. Henry asked Margaret what she wanted to do about the wounded raiders, and she said that was his decision to make because they were off her property now in the legal sense. She had defended her land, and that was all she was required to do. Henry made the call to have the wounded bugs transported to the colonial medical facility where doctors could try to save them or at least make them comfortable. The news of what happened at the Sullivan farm spread through the colony faster than a grass fire in summer. By noon, everyone in New Haven had heard some version of the story, and by evening it was on the colonial network reaching other frontier settlements. The details got exaggerated with each retelling, but the core facts remained true. A single widow had defended her farm against a Kralith raiding party and won decisively. It was the first time any human colonist had successfully fought off a Kralith raid without military support. Governor Lisa Martinez sent a message to Margaret requesting a meeting at the earliest convenient time, and Margaret replied that she could come by the farm the next afternoon after she finished her morning chores. The governor agreed and showed up with a delegation that included military advisors and colonial council members and security personnel. Margaret served them coffee on her front porch and listened to their questions and answered each one directly without any embellishment. She showed them her control room and explained her systems and made it clear that she had no intention of dismantling anything she had built. The military advisor, whose name was Colonel Peter Grant, asked Margaret if she would be willing to share her defensive designs with other colonists who might want to protect their properties. Margaret said that she would help anyone who asked as long as they understood that these systems required maintenance and training and commitment. She was not interested in selling her designs or making money from them, but she would teach others what she knew if it meant fewer families would lose what she had lost. 3 weeks after the battle at her farm, Margaret found herself teaching defensive systems to a group of 20 colonists who had come from farms across New Haven to learn from her. She had set up a classroom in her barn where the walls still showed scorch marks from the Kralith attack. The farmers sat on hay bales and old chairs taking notes while Margaret explained the basic principles of property defense using a portable screen to show diagrams and sensor layouts. She did not pretend to be a teacher because she had never taught anything before, but she knew her systems and she could explain them in practical terms that farmers understood. The group included young families with children and older, couples who had been farming for decades and single, people trying to make a life on the frontier. They all had one thing in common, which was that they were tired of being afraid every time a raid warning went out. Margaret told them that fear was natural, but helplessness was a choice and that they could choose to be prepared instead. She showed them how to start small with basic sensors and alarms that would give them warning time and how to build up from there as resources allowed. A young farmer named Chris Walker, who had lost his wife in a Kralith raid 2 years ago, asked Margaret if everyone needed to build systems as complex as hers. Margaret shook her head and explained that what she built came from 3 years of focused work and every credit she could spare. Most people did not need that level of defense. What they needed was enough deterrent to make raiders decide that attacking their property would cost more than it was worth. She used the example of a fence around a garden. The fence did not need to be impossible to cross. It just needed to be annoying enough that the deer would go eat somewhere easier. She taught them how to read sensor data and how to set up automated alerts that would notify them when something crossed their property line. She showed them how to modify irrigation systems to deliver defensive compounds and how to program equipment to respond to threats. She explained the importance of having backup power and redundant systems because if something could fail, it eventually would. Most importantly, she taught them to think about their specific property and what defenses would work best for their situation rather than trying to copy exactly what she had done. The colonial government had agreed to subsidize defensive equipment for any farm that wanted to participate in the program that Governor Martinez was calling the Frontier Security Initiative. Margaret had insisted that any systems built with government support remain under the control of the property owners themselves, with no remote access or override capabilities. The governor had agreed after some discussion with her military advisors who wanted centralized control. Margaret had made it clear that she would not help with the program unless colonists retained full authority over their own defenses. Over the next 2 months, Margaret visited 40 different farms, helping families assess their properties and design defensive systems that matched their needs and budgets. Some families opted for simple sensor grids and automated lighting. Others built more complex setups with chemical deterrents and modified equipment. A few farmers who had engineering backgrounds like Daniel worked with Margaret to create new defensive concepts that she had not thought of before. The collaborative effort turned into a network of protected properties across the colony. Chris Walker became one of Margaret's best students, and he threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone who had lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. He installed a sensor grid that covered his 50-acre farm, and he modified his irrigation system to deliver defensive compounds that Margaret helped him mix. He set up automated alerts on his datapad, and he practiced responding to simulated threats until his reactions became automatic. Margaret watched him transform from a grief-stricken widower into someone who had found purpose again, and she understood that feeling very well. The Krillith had not returned to New Haven since the failed raid on Margaret's farm, and intelligence reports indicated that they had reclassified the colony as a high-risk target. Word had spread through the raider networks that the human farmers were fighting back, and that easy raids were no longer guaranteed. Other raider species were also taking note, and the frequency of attacks on New Haven had dropped significantly. The Colonial Defense Force was studying this shift in raider behavior, and they were impressed by how effective the Farm Defense Network had become. Margaret received messages from other frontier colonies asking for advice on defensive systems, and she responded to each one with detailed information about what had worked on New Haven. She did not charge for her consulting time because she did not see this as a business opportunity. She saw it as a responsibility to share what she had learned so that other families would not have to bury their children or spouses because raiders faced no resistance. The work kept her busy and gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond maintaining her own farm. 6 months after the attack, Governor Martinez visited Margaret again to present her with a civilian commendation for her contributions to colonial security. Margaret accepted the award politely, but she told the governor that she had not done any of this for recognition. She had built her defenses because she refused to give up what she and Daniel had worked for, and she had shared her knowledge because it was the right thing to do. The governor understood, and she did not push the publicity angle even though the Colonial Council wanted to use Margaret's story for recruitment purposes. Lieutenant Karen Hayes from the Colonial Security Force had been studying Margaret's defensive systems for 3 weeks, and she was both impressed and slightly intimidated by what she had found. Karen had a degree in systems engineering from one of the core worlds, and she had served in the military for 8 years before taking the colonial security position, but she had never seen defensive architecture quite like what Margaret had built. The integration of agricultural equipment with security protocols was brilliant in its simplicity and its effectiveness. Karen had come to New Haven to write a report for the Colonial Defense Council, but she had stayed longer than planned because She kept finding new layers of sophistication in Margaret's work. She sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reviewing sensor logs from the night of the Krelith attack. Karen pointed out how Margaret had used the raiders' own communication patterns against them by broadcasting conflicting commands that created confusion. She asked where Margaret had learned Krelith battle language, and Margaret explained that she had downloaded intelligence reports from the Colonial Network and studied them for months. Karen made notes on her datapad and wondered how many other farm widows across the frontier had this level of determination and technical skill hiding under a humble exterior. Margaret told Karen that the hardest part of building her defensive systems had not been the technical work, but rather the emotional weight of knowing why she was building them. Every sensor she installed reminded her of Daniel and their son. Every defensive protocol she programmed was a memorial to the people she had lost, and a promise that their deaths would mean something. Karen stopped taking notes and just listened because she recognized grief when she heard it, and she understood that Margaret's farm was more than just property. It was a monument to love and loss transformed into protection. Karen asked if Margaret had ever considered joining the Colonial Security Force officially, and Margaret smiled a little and said she was too old and too set in her ways to take orders from anyone. She was a farmer first and a defensive systems designer second, and she had no interest in becoming a soldier. What she wanted was to help other farmers protect themselves so they could keep farming without fear. Karen respected that answer, even though she thought the military was losing out on someone who could teach them things they desperately needed to learn. The report that Karen eventually wrote about Margaret's defensive network made its way up through the colonial administration and eventually reached the Frontier Defense Command, which oversaw security for all the outer colonies. The command sent a team of analysts to New Haven to study the farm defense concept, and they spent 2 weeks interviewing Margaret and examining her systems. They wanted to know if her approach could be scaled up and applied across multiple colonies. Margaret told them that it could, but only if individual property owners maintained control, and only if the systems were adapted to local conditions, rather than imposed from above. The analysts took her concerns seriously because they had seen too many centralized defense projects fail due to lack of local buy-in and maintenance. They proposed a pilot program that would provide technical support and subsidized equipment to frontier farms, while allowing property owners to customize their defensive systems. Margaret agreed to serve as an advisor to the program, but she insisted that her role would be limited to consultation and training. She was not going to leave her farm to become a full-time government employee. Chris Walker's farm was selected as one of the test sites for the expanded program because he had implemented Margaret's concepts successfully on a smaller scale. His sensor grid had detected 3 attempted incursions over the past 4 months, and his automated defenses had deterred all 3 without requiring human intervention. The would-be raiders had retreated when they encountered resistance, and they had not returned. Chris credited Margaret with saving his farm and possibly his life, and he volunteered to help train other farmers in defensive system installation. Margaret watched the network of protected farms grow across New Haven and then spread to neighboring colonies. She received data feeds from dozens of properties showing sensor logs and defensive activations and successful deterrence. The pattern was clear. When farms fought back, the raiders moved on to easier targets. When enough farms in a region fought back, the raiders avoided that region entirely. It was a simple concept, but it required coordination and commitment and access to the right technology. Not everyone was happy with the changes that Margaret's work had brought to the frontier. Some colony administrators worried that armed farms would lead to unnecessary violence, or that civilians with defensive systems would become overconfident and take unnecessary risks. Margaret addressed these concerns in a presentation to the Colonial Council, where she explained that her defensive approach was designed to deter and delay rather than kill. The goal was not to turn farmers into warriors, but to make raiding unprofitable. She showed statistics indicating that farms with defensive systems actually had lower casualty rates than undefended properties because raiders chose not to engage rather than risk losses. The council voted to expand the Frontier Security Initiative to include all colonies that wanted to participate, and they allocated funding for equipment subsidies and training programs. Margaret's role in the program grew despite her preference for staying on her farm, and she found herself traveling to other colonies to consult on defensive installations. She did not enjoy the travel, but she felt obligated to help because she had the knowledge and skills that could save lives. Every farm she helped protect was one less family that might lose someone the way she had lost Daniel and her son. One evening, Margaret returned to her farm after a week of consulting on a colony 3 systems away, and she walked through her fields, checking on her crops and her equipment. Everything was running smoothly, because she had built her systems to operate with minimal supervision. The wheat was growing well, and the automated irrigation was keeping everything properly watered. The sensors showed no threats in the area, and the defensive systems were on standby waiting for activation commands that hopefully would never come. Margaret stood in the middle of her land watching the twin suns set, and she felt something close to peace for the first time in years. 2 years after the Kralith attack, Margaret received intelligence, reports indicating that raider activity across the entire frontier sector had decreased by 40% and that attacks on farms specifically had dropped by 60%. The reports attributed this change to multiple factors, but the primary one was the widespread adoption of defensive systems based on her designs. The raiders had learned that human farms were no longer easy targets, and they had shifted their focus to other regions where resistance was still minimal. Margaret read the reports and felt satisfied that her work had made a real difference, but she also knew that the job was never finished. She continued to refine her defensive systems and develop new concepts that could address emerging threats. The Kralith had adapted their tactics after the failed raid on her farm, and intelligence suggested they were now using more cautious approaches with better reconnaissance. Margaret designed sensor upgrades that could detect Kralith scout drones, and she developed countermeasures that could disable or mislead those drones. She shared these innovations through the Frontier Security Initiative network and watched as other farms implemented the improvements. Chris Walker had become a regional coordinator for the defensive program, and he worked with Margaret to train new farmers in system installation and maintenance. He had rebuilt his life around the work of protecting others, and Margaret saw echoes of her own journey in his transformation. They worked well together because they both understood loss, and they both believed in the practical application of technology for protection. Chris had a gift for explaining complex concepts in simple terms, and farmers trusted him because he was one of them, not a government official or military advisor. The Farm Defense Network had grown to include more than 300 properties across 5 colonies, and the success rate was impressive. Farms with defensive systems reported 0 casualties from raids over a 2-year period, while undefended farms in the same regions continued to suffer losses. The statistics convinced skeptical colonial administrators that the program was worth expanding, and funding increased to support installations on smaller farms that could not afford the initial equipment costs. Margaret insisted that even the smallest farms should have access to basic defensive capabilities because everyone deserved the chance to protect their homes. Governor Martinez visited Margaret again to discuss the long-term future of the Frontier Security Initiative and to ask her opinion on proposed legislation that would mandate minimum defensive standards for all frontier properties. Margaret opposed the mandate because she believed that defense was a personal choice, and that forcing people to install systems they did not want or understand would create resentment and poor maintenance. She argued that education and support were more effective than requirements, and that the program should remain voluntary. The governor listened and ultimately agreed that voluntary participation with strong incentives was the better approach. Margaret's farm had become something of a training center where farmers from across the sector came to learn defensive concepts and see working systems in action. She had built a small dormitory in one of her barns to house visitors, and she had expanded her classroom space to accommodate larger groups. The training sessions typically lasted 3 days and covered everything from basic sensor installation to advanced threat response programming. Margaret taught most of the classes herself with assistance from Chris and a few other experienced farmers who had become instructors. The visitors who came to learn often stayed longer than required because they enjoyed the community that had formed around the farm. People who had experienced raids and losses found comfort in being around others who understood their fears and their determination to protect what they had built. Margaret's farm became a gathering place where farmers shared stories and strategies and supported each other through the challenges of frontier life. She had not intended to create a community, but she had done so anyway, and it reminded her of the early days of New Haven when colonists helped each other survive. 1. Morning, Margaret woke before dawn as she always did and went to check on her greenhouse where she grew vegetables year-round using hydroponic systems that Daniel had helped her install. The tomatoes were ripe and she picked a basket full while thinking about how much had changed in the 2 years since the Krelith attack. Her farm was still her farm, and she was still a widow who missed her husband and son every day, but she had found purpose in her grief. The defensive systems she had built to protect her own property had evolved into a network that protected thousands of people, and that felt like something Daniel would have been proud of. She carried the tomatoes back to the main house and started making breakfast for the 12 farmers who were staying in her dormitory for this week's training session. Cooking for others was another change in her life that she had not expected, but had come to appreciate. The communal meals gave people time to talk and ask questions in a relaxed setting, and Margaret often learned as much from her students as they learned from her. A young woman named Betty Moore from a colony 2 systems away was particularly interested in chemical, defensive compounds, and she had been helping Margaret experiment with new formulations in the workshop. Betty had lost her parents and younger brother in a raid 8 months ago, and she had come to New Haven determined to make sure no one else in her colony suffered the same fate. She reminded Margaret of herself and her intensity and focus, and Margaret took extra time to mentor her because she saw potential for real innovation in Betty's questions and observations. The 2 women spent hours in the workshop testing different compound mixtures and discussing delivery methods and analyzing results. Betty was planning to return to her colony and install a defensive network that would protect not just her farm, but the entire cluster of properties in her region. Margaret gave Betty copies of all her design files and sensor protocols and chemical formulations because she believed that knowledge should be shared freely when lives were at stake. She told Betty to adapt everything to her local conditions and to trust her own judgment about what would work best. She also told her to be patient with herself and with the technology, because building effective defenses took time and testing and willingness to learn from failures. Betty thanked Margaret with tears in her eyes and promised to stay in touch and share her results with the network. The training session ended and the farmers returned to their colonies carrying data pads full of information and heads full of ideas and hearts full of determination. Margaret watched them leave and then went back to her regular farm work because the crops did not care about defensive systems or raider statistics. The wheat needed harvesting and the irrigation needed adjusting, and there were always repairs to be done on equipment. She worked through the day with her usual steady rhythm, and by evening she was tired in the good way that came from productive physical labor. 3 years had passed since the night the Krelith came to Margaret's farm, and learned that some prey fought back harder than predators expected. The anniversary date came and went without any special recognition, because Margaret did not see it as something to celebrate, but rather as a marker of time and change. She stood on her porch in the early morning light looking across fields that were both a farm and a fortress, and she thought about how much had happened since that night. The defensive network had grown beyond anything she had imagined. When she first started expanding on Daniel's designs, and the impact had rippled across the frontier in ways that continued to surprise her. The Frontier Security Initiative now covered 42 colonies and included over 2,000 protected properties ranging from small family farms to large agricultural cooperatives. The casualty rate from raider attacks in participating colonies had dropped to nearly 0, while unprotected regions continued to suffer regular losses. The statistical evidence was so compelling that even the most skeptical administrators had become supporters of the program. Funding had increased every year, and new training centers had opened on a dozen worlds staffed by farmers who had learned from Margaret and then become teachers themselves. Chris Walker had moved beyond his role as regional coordinator and now worked full-time for the Colonial Defense Administration, overseeing the entire defensive farm network. He still visited Margaret regularly to consult on technical challenges and to remind himself why he did the work. He told her once that she had saved his life, not just his farm, and that he would never forget what she had taught him about turning grief into purpose. Margaret had nodded and said that she understood, because that was exactly what she had done, and what she continued to do every day. Betty Moore had returned to her colony and built a defensive network that protected 17 farms in her region, and she had become a respected expert on chemical defensive compounds. She sent Margaret regular updates on her experiments and her successes, and occasionally visited New Haven to share her findings with the broader community. Betty had found a partner and started a family, and she named her first daughter Margaret in honor of the woman who had given her the tools to protect what she loved. Margaret received a photo of baby Margaret, and she put it on her refrigerator next to pictures of Daniel and their son. The Kralith had stopped raiding human colonies, entirely after intelligence. Reports indicated they had lost too many warriors to farm defenses, and the profit margin had disappeared. Other raider species had also adjusted their behavior, and most now avoided agricultural targets unless they had specific intelligence indicating easy pickings. The frontier was still dangerous, but it was measurably safer than it had been 3 years ago, and that safety had been purchased not with military might, but with the determination of ordinary people defending their homes. Margaret continued to refine her defensive systems even though the immediate threat had diminished because she knew that complacency was dangerous. She developed new sensor algorithms that could detect previously unknown threat patterns, and she created training modules for responding to different types of raiders. She worked with Lieutenant Karen Hayes, who had become head of colonial security, to integrate farm defensive networks with official security infrastructure so that information could flow both ways. The collaboration improved response times and situational awareness for everyone involved. Her farm had become legendary across the frontier, and people sometimes traveled long distances just to see the place, where a widow had stood against raiders and won. Margaret found the attention uncomfortable, but she tolerated it because the visitors often left inspired to build their own defenses. She gave tours when time allowed, and she answered questions honestly about both the successes and the failures she had experienced. She wanted people to understand that defensive systems were not magic, but rather the result of careful planning and hard work and willingness to adapt when things did not go as expected. Paul Jenkins, who had tried to evacuate Margaret on the night of the Kralith attack, had installed his own defensive systems with her help, and he often joked that he should have known better than to think she would run from trouble. He was 73 now, and his hands shook a little, but he still farmed his land, and he still checked on Margaret regularly. They had coffee together most mornings and talked about weather and crops in the old days when New Haven was just getting started. Paul said that watching Margaret turn her grief into something that protected so many people had been one of the privileges of his life. On a cool evening 3 years after the battle, Margaret sat in her workshop surrounded by the tools and equipment that Daniel had collected and that she had added to over the years. She was working on a new sensor design that could distinguish between different types of biological signatures with better accuracy than current systems. The work was challenging and absorbing, and it kept her mind occupied in the way that physical farm labor kept her body occupied. She had learned that staying busy was the best way to manage loneliness, and that purpose was more valuable than comfort. The computer system chimed softly, indicating an incoming message, and Margaret checked her data pad to see a request from a Colony 6 Systems, away asking for help designing defenses for a cluster of farms that had recently suffered raids. She read through the details and started drafting a response with recommendations and offering to connect them with trainers in their region. The work never ended, but Margaret did not mind because it meant that people were still fighting back instead of giving up. She finished the message and sent it off, then returned to her sensor design work. Through the workshop windows, she could see her fields illuminated by the twin moons, and she could hear the soft hum of automated systems running through their nightly routines. The farm was secure and productive and alive with purpose. Daniel would have been proud of what she had built, and their son would have been amazed by the technology. Margaret had honored their memory by refusing to surrender and by helping others do the same. The defensive systems that had started as one widow's desperate attempt to protect her home had evolved into a movement that changed how frontier colonists thought about security. Margaret had not set out to start a revolution, but she had sparked one anyway by demonstrating that ordinary people with the right tools and knowledge could defend themselves effectively. The lesson had spread across the frontier and taken root in the hearts of farmers, who were tired of being victims. Margaret Sullivan had lost her son and her husband, and she carried those losses with her every day. But she had transformed that grief into something that protected thousands of families from experiencing the same pain. Her farm was both a memorial and a promise. A memorial to the people she had loved and lost. A promise that their deaths had meaning because they had led her to build something that saved others. The wheat still grew in her fields and the tomatoes still ripened in her greenhouse, and the sensors still watched for threats that hopefully would never come. As night settled over New Haven, Margaret finished her work and climbed the stairs from the workshop to the main house. She made herself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table that Daniel had built. She cleaned up and checked the security monitors one last time before heading to bed. Everything was quiet and secure. Tomorrow she would wake before dawn and check the greenhouse and work on the sensor design, and maybe help a farmer from another colony who was trying to protect their home. The work continued and life continued and Margaret continued because that was what you did when you survived loss. You kept going and you helped others keep going and you built something that lasted beyond your own grief. That was her legacy and her purpose, and it was enough.